to M&A's Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and serve M&A as the Director of Ecosystems Development. Proverbs 16:9 tells us that the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. You know, I have found that church planters are, by nature, dreamers and planners. They're an optimistic sort who, without the history of an established church, often have grand visions of what this church will look like once worship begins and the people gather together. I have yet to meet a planter who ever thought, what if 6 months into our first worship service, a worldwide pandemic breaks out and we cannot gather together, only then to be followed several weeks later by a devastating tornado ripping through the target area, knocking out communications and access to those I'm seeking to reach. Well, that's the story we're going to hear about today. This story is not meant to be a dumpster fire to gawk at and shake our heads about how tough church planting may be, but it is a wonderful picture of God's working in and through his people to reach their community. It's illustrative how all of us might consider how to reach those we might otherwise overlook. Well, today we are joined by a few of those who are on the ground, if you will, in the area where we're talking about. I'd like to introduce them to you. Now, all these events happen in Ooltewah, but our guests, some of them are coming from some other places. The story here is the focus of a new video that just was released this morning by M&A's Multiply. So let me introduce to you our guests. First, we have with us Don Beret. Don has a background as a television producer for 30 years. He is now in a second career on the senior staff at M&A, and he wears two hats at M&A. He's media producer and assistant ESL, English as a Second Language Ministry Director. Part of his responsibility includes M&A's Multiply, that has just switched from a quarterly print version to a monthly video version. Also with us is Benjie Slaton. Benjie is the church planter of Grace and Peace Church in the Chattanooga suburbs of Ooltewah. Benjie and his wife, Natalie, have 3 teenage children. And before moving to Chattanooga in 2018, Benjie served as a RUF campus minister at the University of Texas in Austin, as well as serving on staff of All Saints Church in Austin and Redeemer Church in San Antonio. Also then with us is Tony Crowder. Tony serves as the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol as the acting Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner, Air and Marine Operations. He's also a member now of Grace and Peace. And then also Mike Kennamer is the manager of the Charles H. Jones Family Disaster Response Center and Disaster Response Regional Specialist for Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. Mike started volunteering with M&A Disaster Response in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina had decimated the Gulf Coast, and then joined M&A Disaster Response staff in 2015. Well, before we jump in, let me start off by just saying this is meant to be a conversation. We really invite you to ask questions. There's a chat box and also Q&A feature with Zoom. If you're watching on Facebook, we're not going to be able to track your questions. We're glad you're with us. But if you're watching us through Zoom, please throw us some questions, anything you would like to know more about. Well, just would like to start off then this conversation, going specifically to Don, just giving a little background, we certainly introduced you, but the video that has just been released is a story of Grace and Peace. That's part of what is now Multiply. Tell us how you got connected in this context and the role of Multiply, and then we're going to hear about the event itself. Don, if you could tell us about that.
Sure. For those of you who may be familiar with Multiply, Multiply's been around for 20 some years, and Multiply's as a print piece, and it was distributed 4 times a year, quarterly. The main mission of Multiply was to tell the stories of M&A's ministries, how God's hand is at work through those ministries. We decided late last year that maybe what we wanted to do is to expand Multiply out a little bit and to do a video version of Multiply. I remember when we were doing the printed version, I'd interview people, and I missed getting their passion into words. So with video, we can obviously show those passions and see that passion. So we decided to launch a video version. It is going to be a new video once a month. We started in December with our first video. This January is the second video, and every month we will have a video about M&A and M&A's ministries. The videos will run in length from 12 minutes to about 18 minutes. When we first started, we looked at Chattanooga, and we were calling this a disaster in a disaster, because if you remember, the pandemic struck in March, and then shortly thereafter, a tornado ripped through Chattanooga. So we were going to launch that one as our December edition, and looking at two churches, Covenant and Grace and Peace. Well, when I got up to Chattanooga, I realized these were really two different stories. So the December edition is about Covenant, and the families, actually 6 family members lost their homes. So we tell that story and how M&A's disaster response came beside them to help them. And now we look at Grace and Peace. Grace and Peace is our January edition. I'm so excited that you're going to get to meet the men that were part of this first story.
Okay, well, thank you. So Benjie, as a church planter, you land in 2018 or so. Your first worship service was in fall of 2019. So all this happened. So what were you thinking through this process? Give us a little bit of the background. Again, we've got a lot of planters and obviously a lot of pastors who dealt with the pandemic, but you've got a bit of a double whammy. So tell us the story.
Yeah, church planting is really built on just interpersonal meeting folks. We showed up in the summer of 2018, and this was a presbytery work. There's a couple of ways that you can do a church plant. A mother-daughter church is often the case, where you take 100 people from a mother church and you go off to a different area of town. In our case, this was a scratch plant, which meant that we had a couple of contacts, but most of what we were doing was just meeting folks. We met a family that ended up coming to the church in the park right outside of where we were eating one night, because our kids started playing together. One was a neighbor where we lived. So these people, just these individual relationships that God brought out of nothing, was what we spent about a year cultivating those relationships to get enough people to be able to start worship. So we moved in the summer of 2018, and by September of 2019, we had gathered enough people to be able to launch a worship service, which was the goal. And so that provided all kinds of wonderful opportunities. We were building a lot of excitement, and the early days of a new church, there's you're renting space. There's so many logistical challenges that you're trying to overcome, and new processes that you're putting in. You've got new musicians, the whole business. And so we had just felt like that fall we were beginning to get our feet under us. And then we came into the spring of 2020, and we had just had in February, we had our largest attendance month, sustained attendance. A lot of folks were coming. And then, over the course of a week, we went from, wow, this virus thing is a big deal, to, oh yeah, we're not meeting anytime soon. And as a small church plant, we didn't have live stream equipment. We didn't have hardly any of the things in place, nor the resources to be able to do them quickly, or the staffing to be able to put them in place quickly. And so we were really scrambling. And so I started doing just a little, a daily Facebook Live kind of thing. We were pre-recording our worship service, and it was really low budge. It was not very good quality. And then on the night of Easter Sunday was when this tornado hit, which threw all of that into a whole different set of challenges. So One of the people that's on the call is Tony Crowder, who is a member of our church. Tony is one of the people that we met just in the run up to launching worship, and I thought, just in the interest of keeping this as a conversation and not a monologue, as we preachers are pretty good at doing, I thought I'd just kick it to you, Tony, to talk about what you were seeing as somebody who is not coming from the PCA, not ever been a part of a church plant, what you were experiencing as you kind of came into contact with Grace and Peace in those early days.
Okay, well, I guess kind of a scene setter. I've retired from about 40 years of government service between my military time and my Homeland Security time, and relatively new to the Chattanooga area. And we were, of course, keenly interested in finding a church home and finding a place where we could be part of a community and continue to serve God as He directed us. So we were kind of in the search mode when, and actually had gone pretty far down that pathway. We are not Presbyterians by tradition, but we have been transferred so many times all over the world that we're not really hung up on denominations. We're more concerned about theology and those sorts of things, which I hope is a healthy approach. But nonetheless, where we were getting pretty close to joining another denomination's church. We've been going through the membership classes, the whole bit. And I prayed to God. I said, well, Lord, unless you do something, we're going to join this church. So if you don't want us to join this church, you better do something. Well, God answers prayer, right? So a neighbor in our little community here had invited us to this social event that the Grace and Peace folks were putting on. And it was out at some acreage out on a farm. And it sounded kind of like fun as a picnic and lots of kids and things. We thought, well, we'll go out there. We don't know anybody, but we're not too fearful about meeting new people. So we went out there and started mingling and realized that we felt a community spirit developing there. We felt, kind of like, yeah, these are folks we think we would like to explore, getting to know better, and saw the potential to build a community within this group. So Grace and Peace wasn't a church then, but it was the fledgling embryo of one. And we were attracted to the spirit and the enthusiasm and all that sort of thing that was developing. I will say that and that's kind of how we got started, but I did tell God that I really wasn't that interested in a church start. I said, that's just too much work. I'm getting old and cranky, and there's a lot that goes into building something from nothing. And I kind of was attracted to the easy button of joining something that was already up and running. But, God surprises us all the time, right?
Well,
Tony, you said in the video, but God doesn't ask those questions about your qualifications.
Yes, I guess that's probably fortunate for all of us that He doesn't require us to be qualified to be used. Yeah, you're exactly right, Don.
It's interesting, Tony. You describe what is often the case as people join any church, and especially a church plant. It's through invitation, relationships, connection. But as you described, you're invited to a picnic, to a gathering, which I've heard about those in the past, where you could gather with people and not be
COVID, right?
Not be wearing a mask, right?
Yeah.
So the way in which a church starts, you expect it to continue. So the pandemic hits. So Benjie and Tony, just talk just a little bit, because again, the pandemic has hit all of us, but how did that experience affect the Grace and Peace? But you're just starting. Benjie, you mentioned you didn't have all the tech equipment and everything else in place. We, as the memes were showing up, all of a sudden, all these Presbyterians are becoming televangelists, overnight. So how was that experience in the community of Grace and Peace? Not in the technical end, but in the community.
Yeah, couple of things about that. Number one, we are in an area of Chattanooga that is it's kind of the northeast suburbs. If you know Chattanooga at all, it's on the I-75 corridor heading up towards Knoxville. And this has been an area that's been growing for a while. And the churches here in town had been interested in having a plant in this area for a while. And in many ways, it's just your very typical suburban growth. It's old kind of county, larger homesteads, larger farms that have built, custom home developments on. There's tons of traffic. All the, we're getting a Trader Joe's, so we've really arrived.
Yeah.
And so the kinds of people that tend to find themselves in those suburban environments are here, and and so what tends to happen, though, or at least in this area, it's this area of rolling hills and windy roads that kind of go back into undeveloped areas. And so it's a very spread out area, and there are not a lot of existing there's not a lot of existing social fabric. So you have a lot of people who send their kids to private schools all over town. So you have very few institutional things that bind people together. They don't know their neighbors. They don't know the other people at their schools. They don't know there's not businesses and clubs and other kinds of institutional things that bind people relationally together. Their relationships are elsewhere. And so a church, that's particularly challenging for a church because in some ways we are creating a new social dynamic. None of the people that came to Grace and Peace were friends before they showed up at Grace and Peace. And so we're providing the place where they're developing new friendships, which is great. But that requires a lot of time together. It requires a lot of face-to-face, a lot of meals, a lot of unstructured activity. So community groups and men's and women's events, these things are really important. So when we initially started with the pandemic, all of a sudden, all of the community creation pieces just fly out the window. People are used to being connected to one another online. They've got 1,000 Facebook friends, and they've moved far away from their family. So people are used to keeping some level of interaction with others online. That was easy to overcome. A modicum of connectedness was easy to overcome. What was really difficult for me anyway was creating any deeper level of community, creating a sense of commitment to one another, a deepening sense of being in people's lives, a friendship, because all of that casual time was gone.
If I might add to that, my assessment of the area that we live in is it's a mixed bag in that it is an area that heavily rural from decades ago, but now has become a growth area for Chattanooga. So that's where you see the family homesteads and the farms and that sort of thing, and folks who have lived in the area, their entire lives. But what's been thrust upon them is that because of the industries that are building around here, you're finding an international, not just a new people come in, but an international community that's showing up. And so it's become it's really quite diverse, much more than you would think. In fact, Southern Adventist University is in the middle of where we are. And I have been told it is the most diverse university in America because of the Adventist structure, and people from all over the world return to that university. So we have like a Ukrainian-Russian grocery store on the corner, right? So it's a very diverse thing. Or I met my neighbor the other day, he's from Brazil because his company brought him here. And, I don't speak Portuguese, his English wasn't that great. So it was like, an interesting encounter. But that's going on around us. So Grace and Peace is providing a new opportunity, a little different opportunity to build community, as Benjie said, for people to be connected. God has built in all of us this desire to be, part of something, to be in a community. It's part of our social, inclinations. So Grace and Peace is trying to build that. And we were, as Benjie said, just starting to build some momentum. We're still fledgling organizationally. We're not even technically a church. We're just a bunch of folks getting together every Sunday and now and again. And bam, COVID hits and we're like, what? What is this? So we're trying to figure out, is this real? Is it Memorex? Is it bad? Is it severe? How should we react? And then Benjie, as our leader, is trying to make responsible decisions, that we react as a Christ-following community in a responsible fashion and don't get sucked into all the rhetoric, as we all have heard, all the rhetoric surrounding that particular topic. So yeah, it was an interesting time. And so at Easter was a great celebration for us. That Easter that we were together, it was a great day. It didn't end so great.
Yeah. Okay. And then so there's a tornado, and usually, for a lot of us, most of us, I'd say, when disaster strikes, we're often left slack jaw, feeling powerless, not knowing what to do. So then along comes M&A disaster response. What did that look like? How did that happen? Did they get some writings in the sky? Please go to Ooltewah and help out. What happened? How did that relationship coalesce?
I'll be happy to jump in there, Chris. So we, like everybody, we were, doing virtual church and all that kind of stuff. Heading into Easter, we couldn't do a lot of the, the worship things that we wanted to be able to do during Easter. A lot of the stuff that's really meaningful for folks, and so on Easter night, the tornado that came through was a couple of things about it. Number one, it was not expected. We knew that there were storms coming through, but it was supposed to pass south of Chattanooga. And for whatever reason, I grew up in Texas, so I kind of grew up with an awareness of Tornado Alley. And people are telling me that Tornado Alley has moved to the east, has shifted to the east. I don't know how true that is. All you meteorologists out there can let me know. But there have been three tornadoes over the last, I think it's 15 years, that have hit this neighborhood. And this one in particular, it struck about 11:45, but there was no warning. None of the sirens went off, nothing like that. And I met some line workers later that week. And, if you remember, there was a tornado in Nashville as well. And the line workers had just come from Nashville to Chattanooga to do the work here. And so I was asking them, how does this tornado compare? And they said, oh, this one was much worse. They said the one there was really long and narrow, not very wide, really long path. They said the one here was really short, but it was so wide that what it did was provide this area of destruction that knocked out, when it's really thin, it knocks out some power lines and some infrastructure pieces and things like that, but you can kind of work around it. When it just kind of sits down in an area about a mile wide and 8 miles long and decimates everything inside of that, you have a ton of infrastructure that gets knocked out. So, I went outside after the storm passed, and my particular neighborhood, I'm kind of at the end of a street, and it was dark. All the power was out, of course, but all the houses in my just 2 or 3 streets were fine. It wasn't until the morning that we realized that all of the trees all the way up the hill to our neighborhood were out. Like, you could not get out the roads. And in our area, it turned out that our area was completely decimated. I went down, I took students, I was doing RUF in 2005 and took students down to work after Katrina for a couple of trips. And just the fact that you would go block by block by block by block of just decimated homes and rubble, that's what it felt like at the end of our street. It was unbelievable. and still looks like a war zone as you drive out of our neighborhood. Now, 9 months later, and for my family, we didn't have power for, I don't know, 9 or 10 days. We didn't have internet for much longer than that. We couldn't get out of our neighborhood for about 48 hours. And so I was all of a sudden put in this position of not having any of the resources for communication, having no idea what was happening with the people of our church. I wasn't able to communicate with any consistency. And so it was really a whirlwind. My family, I've got teenagers, so you can imagine all of us sitting on the floor with long, extension cords going next door to the generator that one of us had, and sitting on the floor of our kitchen with a lamp plugged into a strip pad, and all of us with our phones plugged in, just trying to keep enough charge to get anything out. And so, after making sure that our people were okay, and we were thankful that no one in our congregation lost property or their life. We had a couple of deaths in the area. One of the calls that I made was to Paul Hahn. Either the first or I remember walking up the hill to get a cell signal and called Paul, and he and I played phone tag just because he knew where we were and knew about the tornado, and just saying, okay, where, what do we need to do now? And he said, you've got to talk to Mike. Let me make sure y'all talk. And within, just a couple of minutes, we were able to talk to Mike. Mike was able to, it was kind of a three-headed monster. I was talking to Mike. He was talking to us. We were talking to Covenant Presbyterian, which is our closest PCA neighbor. And kind of between the three of us, we're able to develop some initial strategies of dealing with things. So that's how I got in touch with Mike, which was really helpful. Yeah.
So Mike, tell us what happened. What's your story? So the tornado hits. How do you hear about it? When do you show up, and what does it look like?
Okay, so disaster responders are weather watchers by nature. So we hear about bad weather coming through, so we're watching it. And over that 2-day period, we saw tornadoes go through 8 states. And so the first thing we do is we start connecting with the people that we know, the people with whom we have contact. So my particular area, of course, is Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. So I started connecting with those folks that I had contact information for. Those that we didn't have contact information for, we have to track down and check on them. And, in a church plant, you don't have a church office necessarily, but in a lot of cases, you might have a number for the church office on the website. Well, nobody's going to be in that church office after a disaster strikes. So it's helpful when somebody like Paul was able to give us contact information for Benjie. And so we're able to reach out and provide help. A little bit about our method. The way we work is we are not a big staff. We don't have unlimited resources. A lot of churches and denominations will go out and they will take their trucks, they'll unload, they'll do all the work, and then they'll load up and leave. We work through the local church, and we do that for a reason. That local church was there before we get there, and they'll be there after we're gone. So what we are is a resource for the local church. We can provide training, we can provide consultation, we can provide supplies, equipment, things like that. But what we do anytime a disaster strikes is to say, how can we come alongside you and support your work? Because it needs to be the work of the local church. And when we connected, I believe Benjie actually had to drive out of his neighborhood, maybe even walk a ways, I'm not sure, Benjie, but for us to be able to talk on the cell phone, he had to drive out and we had that conversation.
Okay. So once all this connection takes place, where does it go from there? So, I mean, Mike, you were saying you're not just coming in, doing the work and then leaving. There's a connectionalism that's taking place. So how did that all unfold moving forward? And then I want to hear, how did that affect the church community and the community at large?
Yeah, so normally it's a little different. During the pandemic, that changes things. What happened in this situation is our church had actually, we had a tornado come through Trenton, Georgia, where we worship. And so our church was out the next day cutting trees, tarping roofs, and doing all that kind of thing. And so just to make a long story short, I made contact with a lot of people in the area. We talked to Jake at Covenant, different people at different churches. And what we found was I kept hearing this recurring message, and that recurring concern that I heard was the Auburn Hills Trailer Park. And we've got to get in there and do something to help those folks. And Eddie Centurion called me one day, and through our conversation, I said, Eddie, why don't we just get a call together, get everybody that's interested on the line, and let's develop a plan, because I think people were going at it from different directions and people were eager to help. But what we wanted to do is make sure that we were on the same page and working together. So we got a call together. Benjie was on that call. A number of other people were, and we were able to put together a team that really jumped in. And, you know, one person from one church would say, well, I can do this part. And another one from another church would say, I can do this part. And it just showed the body of Christ. You know, some of us are hands, some are feet, some are ears, you know, different body parts. But together, the body of Christ can do so much. You know, the point of what we do is to tell people about Jesus. And mercy ministry, especially in a time where people are taken back, they're undone, it just opens doors, it softens hearts. And you can have conversations, gospel conversations with your neighbors that you could have never had during normal times. I tell people we always have a conversation, regardless where we are. There's a conversation that goes something like this. So let me get this straight. Why are you doing this? What would cause you to take a week's vacation from your job to come out here and to, you know, do chainsaw work in the extreme heat or whatever it may be? And, you know, and we get to, that's an invitation to tell them about Jesus. And that's what we're here for.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So, yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add on to that a little bit. In our particular situation, you know, we're being such a small church that really, you know, in many ways centers around the planter. It's hard to get around that when it's so young. But in our particular case, even though our home wasn't damaged, my ability to lead was really, you know, hampered. I couldn't communicate. And in a disaster situation, you need to be able to communicate very quickly. And so one of the things that we did very quickly was to be able to, I had to get myself out of the center of it. And so we immediately started saying to our folks, look, here's what we want you to do. We want you to, number one, we need to find out if there's anybody in our church that has needs, which a couple of people did, and we were able to go and meet those. But also, we want you to find the needs that your neighbors have and let everybody know about that. And all of a sudden, these kinds of just this popcorn effect of the body of Christ doing what it was made to do began to happen. And so, my particular neighbors, the folks that we've been trying to have gospel conversations with, a lot of non-Christians that I live around, we were able to join folks from Grace and Peace with all of our neighbors to go and to serve our other neighbors, and see some conversations happen there. And that was great. We were able to care for people inside of our church that had to move very quickly. Their apartment was damaged. We had some people with some, tree work and things like that. And then other neighbors of our folks. And but the key was, it didn't have to come out of this centralized structure. It was, this was very Ephesians 4-esque, equipping the saints for the good, for the work of ministry, which is what we're supposed to be doing. And it was really helpful for me as the planter to be able to just give over that sense of ministry and let people go do what God had made them to do. And it turned out things like we'll get to more of the details of the Auburn Hills stuff, but that would have never come about had it not been for Tony and Eddie in particular really taking the lead on that and running with it. And, I'll just do a little sidebar here. As a pastor, being a church planter with the pandemic is hard. Number one, be really gracious with your pastors as they make decisions. They're not sure what to do, and they're not sure they're making all the right decisions. Be gracious with them. But then for me, when I was kind of taken offline, I'll tell you that I've told a lot of my friends that April and May, man, I really struggled. It was really hard to just, there was nothing that felt normal about the work that you were doing. Not only the pandemic, but this tornado as well. Everything had shifted, and just trying to get my feet under me took me a couple of months. I was pretty down, and I would tell our folks that. And I felt like that was pretty normal and expected. So, it was a real challenging time. Tony, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I wanted to say, to that, and getting to Tony is there's nothing more frightening for a pastor than to be gagged, not to be able to speak and not to be with his people. So Tony, from your perspective, Benjie's is somewhat out of commission, communication and such. What was your experience in the context of the response to the tornado and the engagement? What did that look like?
Well, I guess if I could kind of tell our story, if you will, of course, tornado hits and we are in the middle of that 1 mile path, but we were very fortunate. It jumped over our neighborhood. So it's like a war zone around us, and it is hard to describe. It actually is very difficult to describe. But thankfully, the impact to us was not that traumatic. But you could go 5,000 feet from wherever we were, and you would see, quite a lot of destruction. But, as disciples of Christ, we're to live for others and not for ourselves. And Christ's love for us compels us to respond. So we did some time getting our stuff together, some inconveniences of not having power and those sorts of things. But really, we're really quite okay. So, how are we going to respond? So when you think about it, this personal response to God's grace is to act in a manner that's pleasing to God. So we recognize that God uses us for his purposes, and that actually God enables us to work, but God doesn't do the work for us, right? So you got to step up. So Auburn Hills, I was familiar with this trailer park, not only because I live close to it and I drive by it regularly, but in my duties in the volunteer fire department, I've actually made service calls there, medical calls. So I kind of knew a little bit about the community. And this really is one of those communities that's at the fringe of survival. Many of these people, they're not insured, their work, they're even, we don't want to dig into it, but even perhaps their immigration status, many things are questionable there. They have no resources, no safety net. Many of them have nothing. They're just making it barely day to day. So, and it really got hit hard, but, perhaps part of God's plan is to put us in communities that he wants us to serve and to have an impact. So anyway, the need there was bigger than any one entity could take care of. And so the M&A, disaster response, and other community groups coming together were critical to help focus all this effort. So I used kind of the analogy of like maybe a 5-year-old soccer game, right? All the kids are running to the ball, but that's not the right strategy necessarily that to have a successful match. So we needed the coach there to help get us organized, to bring us together, to focus all the help that arrived. And so the experience was these strangers are thrown together. I met people I didn't know. I mean, technically, I'm not even a Presbyterian yet because we haven't become a church. I don't even have a church to nothing, right? So I'm trying to interact with these people. The covenant group shows up. They're wonderful folks. Got to meet some great people throughout our community, but we become co-workers now. So co-workers trying to do things. So we go from strangers to co-workers. Now we kind of become friends, and as Christian brothers and sisters, have an impact. And that friendship is not just the first responders coming in to do things. It's the people that we're engaging with, because they were grateful and they were not sitting on their hands. They were not sitting waiting for a handout. They were there to take care of themselves. And it was really a collaboration of the folks who needed help and the folks who had resources coming in. So it was really good. And as someone said, maybe Mike said it earlier, it does open up for conversations when you go from just a worker showing up to do a job to a friend helping you get through a difficult circumstance. Well, anyway,
no, that's great.
Chris,
John, I want to hear from your experience and thoughts on it.
well, yeah, just as an outsider coming in and interviewing all the men and women from Grace and Peace, there was one word that struck me, one word that I heard throughout every interview, and that was the word family. That this group of people who didn't know each other, as Benjie pointed out, they weren't a mother-daughter church. This was a group of people who had no contact with each other. They were strangers, but they came together and they became a family. And they became a family through prayer. God brought them together. And the love and care that came out of them and comes out of all of the interviews is just an amazing part of the story. I mean, it really is. And I hope in some small way our video shows that. But this is truly a family, and it's a part of God's amazing work through all of this, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's great.
Let me just add a little bit of context for the Auburn Hills thing. One of the things that we realized when Tony was right. We kept hearing, okay, Auburn Hills, that like it's really bad. A couple of folks died there. It's a huge trailer park set in the midst of this beautiful kind of pine forest in this kind of hollow, between hills. All the trees are gone, and these huge old pine trees had just fallen and decimated all these, flimsy trailers. And so what we realized, though, was a couple of things were going on. Number one, this trailer park, the demographic of folks in this trailer park are primarily Latinos, primarily immigrants. They are, most of them are, and this is unlike a lot of the poverty that you see in other similar kinds of trailer parks. It's families that are intact. They are working families. They are oftentimes skilled. They're manual labor in construction. A lot of the men who work there. So these were people that were from day one attempting to do the work themselves. And so one of the first things that we started doing was giving out gift cards to Lowe's, so that people would be empowered to go and do some of the work that they could do on their own. And so within the trailer park, there's a bit of a community that is already present there because of the folks who live there. But what was fascinating when we realized was it wasn't just that they were fighting against the economic challenges that folks in that demographic face, or the pandemic. There was actually some legal issues that were happening as well, because the management of that trailer park, a number of groups had come in to try to do things. Initially, there were churches that were coming in and doing meals. Red Cross was there to provide some just immediate relief. And then, people started bringing donations and money and started going through the management office to do some of that. And within about a week, everybody began to realize that the management had started hoarding those resources and taking the money themselves. And that brought out more stories of a sustained pattern of the management office essentially stealing money. They were charging the residents for insurance and had no insurance for any of these residents. So all of the damage was a complete loss for them. The county sheriff got involved, and we were kind of, trying to help. We're trying to walk this very thin line of, okay, we're trying to be helpful and not get in the middle of all this stuff with the residents. We're talking to some of our people about, okay, this is some of what's going on and we're not sure. And then the media's showing up to write stories about it. I mean, it was really something else to be a part of. And in the midst of that, what that did was it provided enough spotlight on it that some organizations that had been working in other, like one of the providential things we realized was there's a group of PCA folks that in another side of the city had developed a ministry working where what they do is particularly go and do work in trailer parks because there's different building codes that apply to these temporary home structures that regular houses don't have to deal with. And so that we were able to connect with that group, bring them in to really do the majority of the work, that we probably wouldn't have been able to make that connection if it hadn't been for some of the people and some of the media coverage and things like that. So God's hand was all over it, and we felt very privileged to be able to just step into the middle of this incredibly complex situation.
Wow, yeah.
I don't know if I missed any details on that, Tony, because the reality was I wasn't able to show up at hardly any of the work that we're doing.
No, you're bringing flashbacks, Benjie, of going over there, and the management, they lived on site. They had a house there. And so they're there always. And it's true, when this first kicked off, they were chasing people off. And now we know why, because they had secrets. They didn't want to be uncovered. And so it was hostile. And said it was, there was stress. And so one of the things we kind of had to do was, I guess you'll say, soften the relationship with the management there and try to say, hey, look, we're here to help. We're not here to, uncover your sins or anything. These people need stuff, right? Your humanity should demand that we respond. And he did, actually. He softened up a lot and became very cooperative. And so we saw this transformation within him. I don't know if it's because of us, because of God, or because there's an arrest warrant out for him. I'm not sure, but, unfortunately, I believe this guy's in jail now, but nonetheless, it complicated things that were going on at this time. But, as Benjie said, it's God just, I've said this over and over again, He just takes the most improbable people and circumstances, and he does stuff. And so you cannot but unmistakably give him credit, because it doesn't make sense otherwise, right?
No. Hey, we've got just a couple minutes left, and so I want to, we're talking about the event at the Auburn Hills. We'll hear more about that next week. So please, if you haven't registered for next week, do so, and register every week for M&A Conversations. But that's another commercial. But I want to hear, Mike, as far as M&A. So we heard in this instance, which shouldn't be a surprise, when disaster strikes, there are always other factors involved, or you uncover factors involved. So tell us a little bit more from the M&A disaster response side, not only in the context of what happened there at Auburn Hills and the Ooltewah area and Chattanooga area and how you responded, but begin to talk a bit more for our listeners of what it might look like for them moving into the future, how they might be able to be involved.
Okay, great point. I would say if you are in a church plant or thinking about planting a church, there is a very good chance that you will be impacted by disaster at some point. I was one of these people who always went to the disaster, and I went all over the U.S. Responding to disasters. And then I had the experience of the disaster coming to me in 2011 with a tornado outbreak then. And let me tell you, it's a different game. It feels so different. And it is, you can take all the knowledge that you had of going elsewhere and kind of throw that out the window when it comes home. But my passion is to work with churches to train them to be prepared for those disasters. And when we think about disasters, we think about the big disasters, the Hurricane Katrina, the Easter tornado outbreak. The great bonus of training and preparing for disasters is that you have disasters occur in your neighborhood every day of the week. For the widow who has a tree fall on her roof, that's as big of a disaster as Hurricane Katrina ever was in her mind. The Weather Channel's not going to show up, but it is a disaster for her. And if you are prepared to go out and to deal with the big disasters, then you can help that widow in your community deal with her small disaster. And that's what we like to train people to do, to train churches to do. So I would love for any churches listening to reach out. And of course, some of you are outside my area, but I'll put you in touch with a person in your area. And we would love to have that conversation of how you can think about this ahead of time, and then prepare for upcoming disasters. We've seen a lot of church planters over the year that have been impacted by disasters in their first few months, just like Benjie was. So it's not a surprise, but it is never something that we're totally prepared for.
Yeah,
I know. Go ahead.
Sorry. Let me just add a little bit to that. Thanks, Mike. I think that's totally right. And, one of the things that we've talked about as a church is that is what sort of effect is this season going to have on us, in 3, 4, 5 years? And in many ways, while we would never choose it, I joke that all the manuals, church planning manuals tell you to look out for the next, pandemic and plant right in the middle of that. But I do think that one of the outcomes of this has been to slow us down. In April, all of the church planting metrics that you have, and there's good reason to have these metrics and progress reports and plans and all those kinds of things. It's not bad to have those, but for us, we decided we got to throw all that out the window. You know, we got to stop tracking a lot of those things because this is a different situation. And so it slowed us down from some of the growth that we would have wanted to see in year two of a plant, but it's deepened our connection as a church. It's deepened the relationships among the church. It's given more time for a lot of the relationships to really, to really ripen. And it's given us a greater sense of the responsibility that we have to our community and the opportunities that are going to be there over the next couple of years. And I think that could be as transformative as anything. Even if we had 10 more families involved because of the time that we lost, I think the real the power of that time of caring for one another and having to problem solve is really going to be something that gives us, some creativity and problem solving and trust in the Lord. One of the books that I have a lot of our leaders read is that old book by Jack Miller, Outgrowing the Ingrown Church. And one of the reasons that I have them read that is for his discussion on kingdom prayer. And one of the things he says there is that so many churches lose their missional passion because they just, they're doing a lot of the work of church. Their upkeep on ministries and buildings and, leadership structures and all that. And they forget to have a sense of expectancy that God answers our prayers, that God meets us in the midst of life as it really is. And they forget to pray with that sense of expectancy to God, for God to do things that they can't imagine happening in any other way except for divine intervention. And to have a rooted in our vision, our self-awareness as a church, to be rooted in this idea that for us to move forward, God has to do something that only he can do, is really powerful. And we need that as a part of our church DNA. And so, we'll see if we still think that in 3 or 4 years, but this has been a pretty big part of rooting that in the way that we think about ourselves.
If I might add a little more commentary to that.
Yep. We just have about 2 minutes. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, we have nothing. We're sitting in folding chairs in a parking lot to have service, right? Mm-hmm. So when someone like M&A comes along and says, hey, we're here to give you some help, and even like this video and this webcam thing we're doing now, that's stuff that we have nothing. And so this helps us because communicating is the key, as we've said over and over again. So the video, this opportunity here, the conversations that come from this, and the opportunity, I hope, to touch and spark conversations with others and generate interest. So I want to thank M&A for coming in and coming alongside and actually doing things we could not do. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that is great. And it is exciting. We're talking context of church planting, and this applies to any church that is planted and is in this constant ongoing state of renewal. And that the disaster response is critical. And one of the important tools and avenues of communication that we have moving forward is multiply. And so we're so grateful, Don, for putting this video together. In the chat box, you'll see the link to the video. It will be included in the follow-up email that will go out this evening. If you're watching, or if you're not watching but you're registered, you'll be getting the link too, and we'll be able to benefit from this. So I would encourage you to, if you haven't registered for next week's, we're going to be picking up this story. It's not going to be a repeat, but picking up talking about the immigration and refugee ministry and English as a second language, because those figure into this whole Auburn Hills part of the story. And so we appreciate you joining with us today on M&A Conversations and Renewal, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Lord bless. Bye.